And now my final introduction, which is hardly necessary. Jennifer Granholm served as Michigan's 47th governor from 2003 to 2011. And as governor, she led the state through a brutal economic downturn. Now, she didn't create that brutal economic downturn, but it resulted from a meltdown in the automotive and manufacturing sectors. She worked to diversify the state's economy, strengthen its auto industry, and preserve the manufacturing sector, which is so important to Michigan, and added new and emerging sectors such as clean energy to Michigan's economic portfolio. She is a distinguished practitioner of law and public policy at UC Berkeley School of Law and the Goldman School of Public Policy. And she recently served as advisor to Pew Charitable Trust's Clean Energy Program, where she led a national campaign for clean energy policies. After leaving office, the governor hosted Current TV's political news analysis show, The War Room with Jennifer Granholm. With her husband, Dan Mulhern, she co-authored A Governor's Story, The Fight for Jobs and America's Economic Future. And that tells the story of how Michigan pioneered ways out of an economic storm and offers all sorts of good, proven advice for a nation desperate to create new jobs. The book, not surprisingly, became a Washington Post political bestseller shortly after its release. She is honors graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and Harvard Law School, and she and her husband have 3 children. Professor Granholm, we're privileged to have you on the faculty, and very, very lucky and honored to have you present to us today.
Great, thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. Yeah. Actually, shake your hand. I got one of these. So yeah, you can put that away. Thank you very much. So great to hear you, Sally. Doesn't it just make you so proud that you support this great school that supports great Goldman graduates? I just love being affiliated with the Goldman School for reasons like Sally. I mean, it's just such a cool thing. Is it not such a privilege every day to go to work? So I'm going to talk to you. They asked me to give a talk. I did a TED Talk not too long ago, and so I'm going to reprise that a little bit and expand upon it. And I'm going to tell a few stories that I have told to a few people in this room. So I apologize in advance, Lee and Henry and Patty, and those of you who've heard me tell some of these stories before, but some of them are just sort of, defining moment kind of stories for me. So I have to let you know, and telling stories is very important. I have to let you know why Michigan is important to you all. Okay, so I have been obsessed with the fact that Congress isn't doing anything. And I keep thinking to myself, as governor, what would I do, if I were the president, about some of the major issues that are facing us? And I want to share with you some data from my laboratory, which is the Laboratory of Democracy that is Michigan, about 3 of the biggest problems that we're facing and what I think could be a solution if we could just figure out a way to get it in Washington, all right? So here we go. First problem, how do you create jobs in America in a global economy? How do you do this? Everybody keeps talking about it, right? So the story from my lab is from my first year in office. So I was elected in 2002 and I came to office in 2003. And if you recall, 2003, we were just emerging as a nation from a recession. And the whole sort of meme in Michigan was, when the nation catches a cold, Michigan catches pneumonia. But as goes GM, so goes Michigan, right? Because we were such a manufacturing state. So I was told when I was first elected that this is a great time to be elected because the nation is just emerging from this recession. And when you take office, you're going to get credit for all the jobs that'll be created in Michigan as we emerge from the valley of the recession. Well, at the end of my first year in office, I got a call from the head of the Michigan Economic Development Authority, which is our public-private partnership that teams with government and business to make a good business case for them to locate in Michigan. And he says to me, Gov, we got a major problem. There's a little town of Greenville, population 8,000, And that little town is about to lose their major employer. It is a refrigerator factory. The refrigerator factory is Electrolux. And I said, well, how many people of that town of 8,000 does Electrolux employ there? And he says, 2,700 people. So if you can imagine, Greenville actually grew up around this factory, because when you consider parents and children, a town of 8,000 where 2,700 people work at the factory, that is a one-company town. And they have proudly called themselves the refrigerator capital of North America, because in fact, the Electrolux factory was the biggest refrigerator factory in North America. So he tells me we have this problem, and I said, oh, well, that the refrigerator factory is about to go to Mexico? I said, ain't gonna happen on my watch. I'm the new governor. I'm gonna put a stop to this. So I said to my cabinet, let's all go to Greenville and figure out every possible incentive that we can put on the table to keep Electrolux inside of Michigan. And so we did. We went to Greenville, and we met in the City Hall of Greenville, which was about a room about this big, actually. And we had this big square table that went all the way around the room. And at the table was the head of the UAW that represented the workforce, because they wanted to put unbelievable amount of concessions on the table to try to keep the jobs there. The mayor, the city manager, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, all the poobahs of Greenville were there. And we basically sort of, emptied our pockets of chips and piled the chips in a pile and slid the pile across the table to the management of Electrolux. And in the pile was things like zero taxes, state and local, for 20 years. We said we would help to build them a new factory because it was an older factory. We said the UAW offered such a level of concessions they didn't want anyone to know, because they didn't want copycat employers to try to get that level of concessions. We put everything we had. We were going to retrain the workers. The head of the community college was there, all of that. And so the management of Electrolux at this meeting takes our list of incentives and goes outside the room for 17 minutes. And they come back in. And they said, this is the most generous set of incentives that a community has ever offered to us. We've never seen a community bend over backwards like this to try to keep jobs in a community. But there's nothing you can do to compensate for the fact that we can pay $1.57 an hour in Juarez, Mexico. And so they left. This is the factory imploding, like the community imploded. And in fact, when he said there's nothing you can do, I'm like, oh my God, there's nothing we can do to keep this employer here. This isn't just Electrolux for Michigan. Indeed, on the month that the last refrigerator came off the assembly line, this is a guy leaving the factory, the employees had this big gathering at a big pavilion, the Clackle's Orchard Pavilion in Greenville. And it was an indoor pavilion. And it was called the Last Supper, to sort of grieve the fact that the factory was imploding. And I went to the Last Supper, even as governor, even though I wasn't even invited, because I was still like, what could I have done? This is such a failure on my part. I'm a complete loser as a governor that I can't keep this factory in Michigan. And I went to this, and I went in the room, and there were, hundreds of 8-top tables with people sitting around. The 8-top tables have, checkered tablecloths, and people are eating out of box lunches, and there was a band playing sad music, kind of a sad band playing sad music. Anyway, I went up to the first table, and this guy comes up to me, and he's got his baseball cap on, and he's got tattoos, and he brings his 2 daughters with him, next to him, and he says, Governor, he said, I'm 48 years old. I've worked at this factory, he said, for 30 years. He said, my father worked at this factory. My grandfather worked at this factory. I went from high school to factory. And all I know is how to build refrigerators. And then he puts his hand on his chest like this. And he looks at his daughters and he says, so Governor, tell me, who is ever going to hire me? Who is ever going to hire me? And that question was asked by everybody in that room. And everybody from one of the 50,000 factories that closed down in the first decade of this century. Problem number one, how do you create good-paying, middle-class jobs in America in a global economy? Problem number two, and I don't mean to bring y'all down, it's gonna get better. Problem number two is how do you solve climate change? How do we do this when it's very clear what's happening, but there seems to be very little acknowledgement of this in Washington? And I'll spend a little bit of time on that in just 1 second. No question about it. And problem number three is how do you solve congressional gridlock? In fact, I know the data is all important, but there's a very funny poll that was done in January. And the poll compared Congress's approval rating to all sorts of unpleasant things. And it is in fact true that Congress's approval rating is worse than cockroaches, lice, the band Nickelback. Who thinks of these? Root canals and Donald Trump. This was from January. I love working for these polling organizations. It'd be so fun to be thinking about what do you compare them to? The band Nickelback, who knew? But the good news is their approval rating is better than meth labs and gonorrhea. So maybe there's something to work with there. So it got me thinking, as governor, all right, what's worked from a policy perspective? What has worked with this crew in Washington to do something? What is the one Obama administration policy that caused massive voluntary changes across the country?
Race to the top.
Race to the top. It is actually race to the top for education. Caused 48 governors, Dems and Republicans, to convince 48 state legislatures to raise their standards so that essentially every child is getting a college curriculum, a pre-college curriculum in high school. Every one of those governors, there's only 2 states that didn't. Can you guess which 2? Texas and South Carolina. Texas and South Carolina didn't do it, but everybody else said, heck yeah. So essentially they created national education strategy at the state level from the bottom up, right? So it made me think, wow, what if we could do a clean energy jobs race to the top? What if we could put a pot of money out there? Now, for the education race to the top, it was $4.5 billion, which is 0.1% of federal spend. But what if we could challenge the governors to create jobs and put a little bit of an incentive out there to do it? Because after all, this is all about jobs, because the clean energy from the Pew, I have to talk about Pew because I was affiliated with them and Bloomberg New Energy Finance. There's been more than $1.8 trillion of private sector investments globally in clean energy jobs from 2004 to 2012. The top 10 countries, we used to be number one. China is now by far and away number one, but China, Germany, Japan, those countries that are leapfrogging, China in particular, obviously, but Germany have got policy in place that create jobs for their citizens. In fact, if any of you read George Bush's autobiography, Decision Points, well, everybody shakes their head. No, come on. He had a very interesting conversation that he records in there with the president of China, the premier of China, Hu Jintao. And he used to ask every leader sort of a get-to-know-you question. So what keeps you up at night? And what kept George Bush up at night was, of course, the threat of terror. What Hu Jintao says, what keeps me up at night is creating 25 million jobs a year for my citizens. So I'm going to do everything I possibly can policy-wise to create jobs for people. Now, in the United States, if you ask people what their top priorities are, economy and jobs, 86, 70, and 79%. Global warming is way down here at 28%. So maybe it's a question of framing. Maybe it's got to be really a jobs proposal rather than a global warming proposal. But there's huge favorability on creating jobs. So I was wondering to myself, I wonder if all these governors, and there's been a changeover since I was governor. There's been a few new governors, a lot more Republican governors who have not necessarily been in favor of federal policy, But if you could do it in a way that respected them and tell them that 1 in 4 jobs and 37 million jobs are expected to be created by 2030, the question is, where are those jobs going to be? Are they going to be in China, in India, or are they going to be in the US? There maybe a sense of competition would get them going, because there are more solar jobs in California than acting jobs. Texas has got more solar jobs than ranchers. And so the challenge to the governors could be a competitive challenge. And the price to entry into this competition. So for the race to the top for education, the price to entry was that everybody had to raise their standards. And then they added bells and whistles about teacher improvement and all of that. And the ones who won the race to the top had the most stuff that they added in. But the price to enter was that you had to raise your high school standards. What if the price to entry was that as a state, you've got to put, I mean, if you just pick what the president has said, his clean energy standard is 80%, to get 80% of your energy from clean sources by the year 2030. Now you could pick whatever standard you wanted, but essentially requiring that everybody do that first, and then you can broadly define clean energy. Some states would want to include natural gas, some states would want to include, carbon capture and sequestration, whatever. The bottom line is every state has something to offer. In fact, if you looked, I've got my little thing here with icons. So this is, look at Terry Branstad and John Kasich, Ohio and Iowa, not two unimportant political states, but those two states having expertise in, say, wind. This is I'm just making this up, sort of. If you had the Sun Belt states say, we're going to be the place where solar is produced and solar panels are made. And other states did the same thing and said, we're going to, if you had up here, the geothermal potential in the US is really great. And those states say, we're going to lead the nation in producing geothermal solutions for the country. Texas, they could do wind, they could do solar, they could do, what if they did smart grid? Because they need to have a smart grid connecting all of the renewable energy from Texas. What if, I had a corn piece because I couldn't find an icon that was biomass, but I don't really think that corn is really the right metaphor, but you get the idea. I'm saying these states potentially could use biomass to be able to produce energy. And if you look way up here, they've got huge expertise in efficiency, for example, and offshore wind here in the Atlantic states. And of course, in Michigan, it's all about the electric vehicle. If every state brought to the table, if they did a SWOT analysis on their economy, on their resources, did a testing their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, every state has something to offer. And the beautiful thing is it respects us. So just quickly on batteries. So in Michigan, I have to tell you about this because we responded to a competition. When the president put together the Recovery Act, he said, we want to have batteries for electric vehicles built in the US. And we said, well, hello, we built car 1.0 in Michigan. We want to build car 2.0. So you better believe we are going to get those battery grants. So we teamed up with the private sector, and I went around the world identifying, and I literally went around the world with governor, who is making these cells? And what's in the cell? It's an anode, a cathode, separator material, and electrolyte. That's a whole industry. Who is making the best separator material? We're going to go get that company and bring them to Michigan. We're going to get the anode and the cathode makers and bring them to Michigan. We're going to create a whole industry around the battery for the electric vehicle because it's all about jobs. And we competed for that, and Michigan got more than half of all of the battery grants that were given because we had a strategy and the competition was ripe, and I hate losing. Those 17 companies we attracted, those are projected to create 63,000 jobs, $5.8 billion in investments just because of that competition. So I know governors are competitive. Policy does matter. And we did the same thing with other energy businesses and huge amounts of effort in Michigan related to moving from an old Michigan economy to a new Michigan economy. But the bottom line is, if you did a clean energy race to the top, it would respect the states and allow them to, grow their nascent industries. It's opt-in, so it's not forced. It's not a top-down. Republican and Democratic governors, we love to cut ribbons. We love to bring jobs. And it does foster innovation at the state level. You can imagine that the states who would win would be states that partner with other states. So you see the regions developing a strategy together because, renewable energy and the resources don't know geopolitical lines. So do it by region. Or you could reward states that decide to team up with their banking systems to provide low-cost access to capital, to get the factories in the ground. The bottom line is you could have all sorts of innovation happening at the state level, and you could reward that state level innovation. What do we have right now in terms of a national economic development strategy is that governors go around the country poaching. I did it. Rick Perry's been doing it. Every governor goes to another state because we don't have the resources necessarily to go to other countries. We can't, as a state, compete against China. So I used to come to Silicon Valley as governor and say, you guys have the great ideas, you've got all the venture capital, but when you take your idea to scale, we can do that. We can be the manufacturer of it. Come to Michigan. It's a really stupid national strategy for economic development because you're just moving the chairs around on the deck of the Titanic. But what if you allowed, right? What if you allowed for every state to really focus on their strengths and emphasize those things that they can be competitive in globally? So the question is, $4.5 billion. How do you pay for this? Could we ever get Congress to do it? Well, Congress did support the race to the top for education, but of course that was in the 2008-2009 period when there was parties that supported Congress controlled the House and the Senate. However, because you have so many governors who supported race to the top for education, and it was something that was a bottom-up strategy, you might be able to say to Congress, for example, how about this? How about you develop a strategy to bring back some of the offshore dollars that are currently sitting out there? There's apparently $1.7 trillion of money from US-based companies that are not bringing that money back because they have to pay a 35% corporate tax rate. What if on a one-time basis you said to those companies, bring those back, we'll lower the rate to say 10, 15%, and take that 10 or 15% and use it to capitalize a clean infrastructure bank, for example, repatriating offshore profits, and use that, because you're actually lowering their tax, right? Could Republicans and Democrats agree to do that if it was focused on creating jobs in America? You could create a 21st century broadly defined infrastructure bank by a one-time incentive to be able to do that. Or what if we could go around Congress? Now this is heresy in a public policy school. But honestly, my worry is that if we are going to be faced with gridlock until the next census comes around and we have redistricting that allows for more rational districts so that you've got a Congress that is able to compromise, I worry that government ends up becoming obsolete. We have, we're here at the Goldman School and we're always trying to think about creative ways to get stuff done. My kids, actually, their friends were over the other night and they said, Mom, with what's going on in Washington, government is becoming irrelevant. The action, they said, is in the private sector. That's where stuff is happening. I'm like, ah! But what if the private sector was able to figure out a way to step up and challenge the governors? What if you had a Google challenge to the governors to create clean energy jobs, a Gates challenge? You got connections there. To the governor to try to make a clean energy race. Either way, I just know as a governor this would work, that we would be able to create a national energy strategy policy from the bottom up. Because our economic competitors every single day are out there eating us for lunch. We can either be at the table or we can be on the table. And I don't know about you, but I prefer to dine. Thank you all so much. I'm happy to take any questions. Does anybody have a few $billion they want to put toward this? Yes, Dan.
Jennifer, China fundraises here, and China looks for engineers who are ready to go, whether they're Chinese citizens or American citizens here in Silicon Valley, more than anything else. So what about the third rail here, which is that we need China and China needs us? And what about the opportunities to make this a race to the top internationally?
Oh, love it. Who would fund it, though? Could China challenge all nations by putting a big pot of money on the table?
Well, I mean, that's where I would start, not just with Chinese money, but if you want to repatriate money and you want to move it around, not just within states,
Right.
U.S. and China, you want to create more jobs here globally, right?
Right.
So, for example, the China-U.S. dispute on solar, which is actually mediated by Germans, but we'll leave that aside. That's a battle that is exactly what you talked about in terms of that's rearranging chips and that's benefiting neither country.
Right.
We're seeing bankruptcies in the big solar companies in both countries right now as a result. So what about taking this up one level?
I love that idea. The question is, though, always the tough question, right? Is what's the mechanism for funding it where people feel like they're getting a return on their investment, right?
Free trade and clean energy.
Right. So you wonder if you could hold out a contribution to more, some kind of trade arrangement, whether it's in energy or something like that, that says the price to enter this agreement is that you have to contribute to some kind of competition that would enable these countries. Because, right now, as Dan knows, the great leadership, I mean, Dan has forgotten more about any of this than I'll ever know. So, but the great issue is that the U.S. is just not at the table at all. We've completely abdicated our leadership on this because we aren't even present, basically, at any of the global discussions on energy. So I think that's a fascinating idea.
I'll write you a note.
Write me a note, and then we'll send it together to Washington, all right?
There was a story in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times a couple weeks ago about 17 Chinese auto parts manufacturers were moving to Michigan,
Right.
hiring all these engineers in the auto parts industry that were laid off.
Right. As governor, I'd be all about that. Honestly, I would be all about getting international investment. And in fact, I went on 20 trips to try to get people to invest because a dollar is just as green from a Chinese company as it is from a U.S. company. And there is co-opetition benefits from domestic and international companies providing work for suppliers, et cetera. And I think that if you have a global view about it, if you don't view it as purely they're coming to take our jobs away, but they're coming to provide us with jobs, then I think it's a healthy thing. Yeah.
You found a good Republican who would sponsor it?
There are, that's the question, right? I think there's been a push on both sides of the aisle for this repatriation idea. Some of the repatriation suggestions have been that the money just gets lowered and there's no benefit, so that the companies get to keep the added benefit. So you give them essentially a tax holiday for a year. But the last time that was done in the early 2000s, there was no demonstrated jobs created. It was essentially the companies obviously took that and gave dividends to their shareholders or reinvested perhaps in buying their own shares. But my concern about that strategy is, you're not guaranteed job creation. And to me, it's all about jobs in the U.S. And if we're going to create good paying jobs, we've got to make sure that we have a commitment to investing in those jobs as a country. And it's difficult when we're in an environment where people are still bowing to the altar of laissez-faire and hands-off, which is great in theory, but when we're in a global economy and our economic competitors are not playing that way, it makes it very difficult for us to still abide by that and watch our jobs get taken away with no reciprocal benefit. There are Republicans and Democrats who are interested in a repatriation and a capitalizing of an infrastructure bank that's more traditional infrastructure, but the way things are, especially after this week in Washington, the way things are now, I just worry that there's not going to be any major offense played out of Washington, that it's really all going to be defense. And it's just so hard to watch, isn't it? It's just so hard to watch. Yeah.
So if government is becoming more obsolete,
in some ways. Is the funding mechanism for this, should that be rethought in a way of, could turning to the citizens and actual citizen engagement around crowdfunding?
Could you do a $4.5 billion crowd-funded opportunity?
Like the Kickstarter on steroids.
You're on it. Yes. No, it would be awesome to do something like that. I am not smart enough technologically to know how that might happen and whether, you'd have to know, could you get enough support? I mean, that's a huge amount of dollars. But from individuals, but from government, that's a drop in the bucket. So the question is, could you see something like that happening from the crowd?
I mean, from the crowd, it also creates a demand for the products that will be
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Warren Buffett, Bloomberg, Gates, and Sergey Brin alone. Those guys, come on. It's a drop in the bucket. Any other questions? Yes, John.
An observation of a question. One is I couldn't avoid the opportunity of saying, your map when you had all the states specializing in what they do. And just imagine if the UC system of universities actually specialized in what we do as opposed to trying to treat all the universities the same. And we had a governance system that allowed us to do that.
That's an interesting.
Let me not go where I want to go. Because it's exactly the same message. Rather than trying to pick each other's pockets, why don't we make each university terrific and cater to what they're good at?
Right.
And that'd be a great model, which is not what we have at the moment. But anyway.
Well, I would just say to that, I think that's a great notion that every university can specialize, but I would say that there's enough demand for broad education so you'd have to include more than just a specialty, I would think.
But the more serious question is, so one way to incentivize what you're doing would be a carbon tax, and that could only be done at the federal level. Because you could do all
How likely do you think that would be happening in Washington?
Well, no, so that's why I come up against you can't ignore government. You could do all this stuff, and if it's cheaper for Fred or Mary to buy, gas from factoring, they're going to buy it. And so, I guess my question is, how do you create a carbon tax that internalizes externalities so that this type of thing gets some traction? Otherwise, it's pushing a rock up a hill. Yeah,
I think that the only way this works is if the states take on demand-side strategies that would make sure that the products actually are going to be used. If you have only supply-side strategies, we've seen the market breakdown in that. So, yeah, I totally agree with you on that. And states could be rewarded if they did their own carbon taxes, or if they did feed-in tariffs or some other version of a demand-side strategy. Yes, Sally?
Well, this was wondering, the detail person in me wonders about the metrics and so what job quality? What about job quality metrics? How will all this you're hitting on a lot of different areas,
right?
But haven't really said how this stuff would actually be weighed and who wins or not. And I think that, to me, that goes to the point of what's the role of government? The role of government can create rules, can create a standard, right? Maybe you have a minimum wage that everyone has to meet, which is part of the reason why all the jobs are going to China. But how does that all play in here? And then the second piece is that the reason why I like the idea of the government, federal government playing a role if you can make it happen, is if they can do the other good piece, which is collecting data and sharing best practices, right? They can see what's actually happening in each state, and they can have a big database that shows all of it and helps states with everything from the nitty gritty of the laws to the.
This is the GSPP nerd. I love it. It's awesome.
Study whether it's working.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's effectively what they did at the Department of Education with Race to the Top. So ideally, you would want this housed in the Department of Energy or something like that, and. I often wonder, could the president convene some of these big funders? And if the Congress won't do it, maybe you go around Congress by having the president convene it, but he gets the agreement that it would be done through the Department of Energy, so you could keep those metrics and so you could identify what are the levels of jobs and how do you decide who wins and who doesn't win. In Race to the Top for Education, initially only 4 or 5 states won, and all the rest of us were really ticked off. So then they had round 2 and round 3. So eventually, everybody was a victor in some way, shape, or form. I think they would learn from that a little bit, because people aren't going to do something like raising their standards 80% by 2030 unless they felt like they were going to get something for it, I would think. Yes?
That's a totally spurious question, and that is, if you were still governor of the state of Michigan, would you try to lure Tesla
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I met with Elon Musk. I was begging for him to come to Michigan. I was saying to him, "You've got this fabulous product. You should come to the state where the car industry is." So yeah, no, I totally would have been doing that.
He was close to coming.
Do you know? And turn that Numi plant. But anyway, yeah.
I like what you said about reframing the issue about the social welfare part, and then reframing it in terms of jobs and what the economy, what it will do for the economy, and how do you start that discussion? How do you reframe?
Yeah, this is the big question. Framing is always the issue. I know that some of you had this discussion at the board meeting about framing the need for the university in Sacramento. Frame is everything. But if you have a jobs policy and you've done your homework in going to the governors and saying if you were to be rewarded, I mean, there's obviously an intrinsic reward for governors to bring jobs to their state, but if there were some extra ability for them to use some of that capital to fashion a policy that would be, successful for them, it would be huge. But you'd have to go to the governors first. I think that's how you start that conversation in the frame. But it all has to be, we at Pew, we did a whole series of testing in language about what language do you use, what language. And at the time, this was a couple years ago, and so things may have moved a little bit, but if you talked about climate change or global warming, people went, whoa. It was all about jobs that people were focused on. And I don't think it's probably too much different. Even after Hurricane Sandy and all of that, I still think people are not quite there as that poll showed. All right, last one. That's it? That's it? Yes. Can't resist. Yeah. All right.
So you have this tremendous vision, and you have some thoughts about funding mechanisms, but it needs a leader. So who's that going to be? Who are they going to be? Are you going to be one of them?
Well, this is the great question. I am just a distinguished practitioner of law and public policy at the Goldman School, and I've been trying to give this away. Actually, I've been trying to give it away to people who are maybe in positions to do something with it. So here. Any of you who have $4.5 billion that you want to put into this, I'd be happy to support it. No, I've met with the White House a number of times on this, trying to get them. They're big on competitions. The president just announced another competition with these national manufacturing centers. So they completely agree that competition is a great way to go. It's just the size of challenging all the states to do another race to the top for education. It's just that size that's the difficult nut for them. And they're also interested in repatriation and capitalizing an infrastructure bank. So it may yet come together in the way that we would all love to see. And the question is whether we can get votes in Congress for it. So, all right, with that, thank you all so very much.